Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. This is Jewish history like you've never heard it before. Behind the Times, with Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galinsky and Gedalia Gutentag. A few weeks ago, former mainstream conservative media star turned anti-Israel obsessive Tucker Carlson made an extraordinary claim that Chabad is a shadowy force pushing the Trump administration towards war. There are key players involved in this war, Carlson said, who believe that what we're seeing will usher in events that begin with the destruction of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then the rebuilding of the Third Temple. This has been going on for a long time, he added in his characteristic high-pitched voice, through, in part, the efforts of a group called Chabad. Naturally, a Chabad spokesman reached for a very old term in response, blood libel. There was no blood in Carlson's accusation, but the structure, the logic was unmistakable. Because this may be the most striking and most mainstream return of this old idea. Blame the Jews. The shadowy Jewish networks are pulling the strings behind the scenes of non-Jewish society. That Jews are not just different but dangerous, hidden and controlling. Actually, in today's climate, Tucker Carlson's comments weren't even the most explicit. In a British seaside town, an exhibition by a former newspaper art critic has drawn outrage for imagery depicting Jews as grotesque, blood-soaked, even demonic figures. Your local police, in the last few weeks, have confirmed they will take no action. So we're not dealing with fringe whispers anymore, we're watching something re-enter the bloodstream of the public discourse. So let me ask you, Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galinsky, are we witnessing the return of the blood libel?
It's very interesting when you describe Tucker Carlson's claim. You can see a pattern. When you learn the history of the blood libels, you can see a pattern that all the concepts are there. Like, let's take Tucker Carlson's thing. It's true that Chabad talks about Mashiach, right? And it's true that Mashiach involves building a Beis HaMikdash, and that involves removing the mosque from... But the connecting threads to what's going on today, that they don't have any proof for. It's just like...
And it doesn't exist.
It's just like... they throw in all these concepts, and in Mitzvah Hashem, when we'll progress with this podcast, I'm going to show to you later on that at least in the Bayless case, the blood...
Mendel Bayless blood tribal,
right,
much later in the 19th century.
You see that the people who were leveling the accusations, they had a lot of information, and they were throwing it out right and left, but... There was so much amaratzis there.
It's amaratzis, and it's evil amaratzis, I would say. And I think let's set up the ground. You're correct in this. Let's set up territory ahead for this episode. In this pre-Pesach episode, I want to step back and ask a few questions. First of all, where did these accusations actually begin? What was the original moment when Jews were first accused? Not just of being different, not just of being evil, but of committing ritual evil, ritual slaughter. That's number one. Number two, I think it's important to know kind of these giving things away. This was the time, the Rishonim. How did the Rishonim who actually lived through these accusations, how do they understand and respond to them? What, if anything, do we have traces of their response? And a third, I think it's an opportunity to talk about a very striking insight that I think can reshape how we think about the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic distortions around us today. I want to get that weighing in.
But I want to ask you a question, Dalia, and we have to make a differentiation. I mean, Goyim have been hating Jews since Maimon Sinai, right?
As in fact, the Gemara says,
Sinai and
Sinah, yeah.
Right. So, and we know of the Crusades.
Yep.
And we know of pogroms. Now, not every time that there was a blood libel are we talking about a case of accusing the Jews drawing blood out of the body of a Christian boy, whatever it is, to use for Pesach. There could be many other accusations, like Tucker Carlson, right? Tucker Carlson is not talking about actually
Correct,
using
and
blood.
that is why.
That's my question: is where did this? Because we both found from the Rishonim talking about a similar case of a blood libel, but there again, it was not talking about a case of drawing blood from a child. So the question is, where did that start?
Okay, so I think just to frame our discussion, obviously there's an element of wider thinking here in associating Tucker Carlson, who doesn't talk about Jewish blood, but he talks about these kind of, Jewish conspiracies, Jewish power. That's not a blood libel, but it's accurate to understand that, not to nitpick. This is not about blood, whether Jews, because I remember one of my Rebbeim in school describing, in England, how he had gone through what in America they'd call it public school. Actually, in public school in England means a private school. It's the opposite meaning. But he'd gone through in non-Jewish school, and he said this was a standard thing. When the non-Jewish boys wanted to mock and taunt the Jewish boys, I don't know how many there were of them, but he said they would say, "You killed our Lord." That was a standard thing.
Right.
And not only, I distinctly remember him saying that they felt his head for the horns, because the Jews was meant to have horns because he current or upon for the entire thing. And these tropes, these ideas are rife still.
Michelangelo, right? That's what it's
correct.
Michelangelo
is a portrait of Moshe, and if I remember correctly, outside Krakow, or one of the big cathedrals there's a reproduction of that in one of the big outside the big Polish cathedrals. You can, not having been to Italy, you can see this huge thing, and there it is with these horns sticking out. But anyway,
so getting back to my question, where did it start? That story or that accusation that they're using blood? That's my question.
So let's just say like this. When we talk about blood libels, really it incorporates a variety of different things, each of which started at different points and can be pinpointed more or less. One of them, I think we can divide it up, what you call ritual murder. And this is going to be very important. Jews murdering Christians as part of a religious ritual or rite. Ritual murder, we're going to say, we can see in a minute, we're going to see where it starts. But I think it's important to understand this is the second category, that you also have that blood libel, the idea that not only do Jews kill Christians because of an act of religious worship, they actually use their blood to make matzahs. And that's basically a different thing. And there's a third element, which once the first two kind of became established, and they work kind of hand in hand, because you can imagine. But once that becomes established, then there becomes a third trope out there, third canon, which is a host desecration. In the Catholic form of Christianity, there's this idea they eat what's called the wafer. Wafers, it is meant to be embody in it the Oisoi Ish, Yoshki is meant to be, and when you eat it, some of his spirit goes into it. Not that we need to go into much of these things, but it's important to understand where this came from. And therefore they said that Jews were seen stabbing these wafers, right? I don't think it means like a, man wafer with, filled with lemon or cocoa or chocolate, a wafer bread, and they will cause damaging or torturing the wafer. But the wafer is Yoshki, and therefore, unbelievably, Jews were accused of this, and violence ensued because they tortured a piece of bread. You see the derangement of the medieval Christian mind. Those are three different things, and they'd come back in different periods. Well, let's start with this idea of ritual murder slash blood libel, because it begins.
That's where the term comes from, right? So that's what we're trying to find out.
And it begins in, as ever, as all great things do, in England. England gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. The internet was invented by a British man. Lots of good things have come from there. But if you look back into the 12th century...
Including Gedalia.
Including, yes, none other than the man behind the microphone over there. I was indeed invented there. And 1144 in the city of Norwich. Now, Norwich is important for American listeners. Norwich is written Norwich, but it's pronounced, there's a silent letter, it's a Korean ksiv over here, Norwich. Norwich is on the east. It's poking out in the bit of eastern England that pokes out into the sea. North Sea is called East Anglia. And in fact, it's very interesting. I was just thinking about that before coming on air over here, because when you talk about the Rishonim call England, as in Ivrit, England is known as
Chachme Anglia.
Right, there's a Tosfos
Tosfos
Chachme
Chachme
Anglia. Where did that term come from? So it's very interesting. In England, England is Eng means narrow, and it's a narrow country, right? It's England. We talk about Anglo-Saxons. It comes from, there were a Germanic tribe who invaded, in one of the many invasions, and they were the Angles. And they were from northern Germany, what's called Schleswig-Holstein today. That's where the original Angles came across, but somehow Anglia, where they settled on the northeast part of England, that's the only bit of it still called Anglia. So it's very fascinating to know. And
the Goyim.
But that's the name of the area, wow. East Anglia. It's actually on the maps. And Anglia itself divided into a number of historic counties. Norfolk was the place, the north, the folk settled in the north. And then there's Suffolk. Right, and it's all in the same area. You said
something very interesting. So when we talk about Tosfos Chachme Anglia, we're not talking about Tosfos Chachme England. We're talking about Tosfos Chachme Anglia from that. No, because you're saying England has a different meaning to it. England, you're saying, is narrow.
No, there's different names because they're different names. But when we talked about Anglia, it is the whole, as the Chachme Anglia are referring to the whole. Who were part of the Tosfos Chachme Anglia include Rabbeinu Yom Tov, who lived in York, which is
not in that area,
right? Which is central England. So I'm just pointing out that it's interesting that historically there is a record of the way that our own Makoros label this country, the Baalei Tosfos called this country. There is a record in this historic county area called East Anglia. Anyway, Norwich, something happens there in 1144. What happens there is an important Jewish community living there. And now it's an important bit of background, because who is important? The background is to understand that this is a Jewish community in the 12th century. The Jewish community was essentially a French Jewish community. Because earlier, 1066, this is a date that every English school child used to know, 1066, in Rashi's time, the Duke of Normandy invades Normandy, the area on the western part of France, invades England, seizes the throne, defeats the English king, and becomes the King of England, known as William the Conqueror. Okay, he brings across with him the French or the Norman nobility, and for the next 200 years, the Norman nobility of French speaking, it takes them about 200 years to integrate and to become English, right? And during that time, what happens is they are still connected. Remember, England is ruled by the man who's the Duke and the overlord of the area in France on the coast immediately opposite it. So there's both sides of the channel are held by the same man, the same dynasty, the same family. And naturally, therefore, the Jews who are living in the area of Normandy come across the channel in repeated waves. When you need a Rav, the French Jewish community living in England, who's the Rav? They don't go to a local grown boy who went to a local yeshiva, none of which exist. They call a Rav from France. From France. And that's what happens. And that is why these communities in the 12th century basically are living under the protection of a royal castle, which would have been something that William and his descendants have built. In fact, in Norwich, there is still today the castle built by William the Conqueror. Literally in the shadow of this castle, under royal protection, was the French Jewish community living in Norwich, in England, right? Or French speaking, let's call it. And that is where the blood libel or where the charge of ritual murder happens.
And this is the first
This is the first one, because from this one, what actually happens over there is that there's a boy, William, who's later canonized as Saint William of Norwich. He's a boy of, I think, 11 or 12, and he disappears, and a charge of murder comes, because what happens is the boy's family and the local townspeople, who are obviously primed by this, must remember, this is the age of the Crusades, right? This is the time of the Crusades. The 12th century, between the First and Second Crusade, the Christian fervor and the Christian Frumkeit of the European and English population is at fever pitch. They're willing and able and ready to go off at a moment's notice to sell their life's belongings and to go and it's in the same level of religious fervor that we see amongst jihadists today. That was Christian Europe back then, right? So it's no wonder that the good Jews living there are tittering. They're shaking with fear, and stuff happens every so often. And one of that bit of stuff is this accusation. So what happens over there?
So even before this accusation, I understand from what you told till now, is that they were afraid in any case from crusades that are going to do them, and that's why they lived near this castle.
Correct. We already seen that in the First Crusade, right, which is 50 years before this happened. First Crusade in Germany, the terrible events in the Rhineland. Remember, Christian Europe is a large area, but in a way, before it became divided between Catholics and Protestants on the Reformation, hundreds of years later, yes, there's different countries, very different countries that can fight each other. France will fight Germany, Germany will fight England, France will fight England, but they have one faith. And therefore, ideas, and this is very crucial to understand, ideas spread very easily between one and the other. And this is what's going to happen, because, let's just finish this episode over here. What happens over here is a monk called Thomas of Monmouth is basically writes a very long book in which he called The Life and Miracles of St. William of Norwich. Basically, he was saying that there'd been exactly what had happened to this boy. He was, he was throttled to death and then he was killed. Now, what happens is the local sheriff, who is, as you can see, the French influence, his name is John de Chesney, right? So Chesney could pass for an English name today, but he shows that's already a French thing. He says that the court has no authority over the Jews who they wanted to summon to trial for this type of thing. And that is more or less what happens. The actual incident ends. That there's no massacre and there's no killing, but there is an accusation. And it's the first time in medieval Europe that this idea that Jews are going to murder Christians part of a ritual has taken root.
So how did this play out that there was no killings at the end?
Well, that would have been, you see the strength of the Norman of, remember,
that was the protection.
Now, that protection does not last or is contested, because for the next 50 years, things get gradually worse. We know, if you look in the time, this is 1144, 45 years later, we have something very, very famous in 1190. The York Massacre. What is happening is Richard the Lionheart of England, who's by then, it's amazing, actually. People know him as Richard the Lionheart in England, but he actually was a French-speaking king known, I think, is Richard Coeur de Lion. That's where it comes to, the heart of a lion. Why do I bother with a tra-la-la-la French? Because that's actually what he spoke. He wasn't an English king in that sense. He was descendant of William the Conqueror, but this was a French-speaking king, and all his court was still French. And
so when they resided in England.
They resided in England and had done so for a century and a half by that stage. And what in fact happens is in 1190, in the same year as York, what we obviously know that Clifford's Tower, 150 Jews are besieged and killed in Clifford's Tower. In the same year, the Jews of Norwich are murdered in their homes, and some managed to flee to the castle. So you see...
So it reached them back at the end.
Yes. What has happened is, in the intervening years, we find, again, it's important to get this, 1144... The Jews of, this was the case that we've begun with. 1168, there was accusations of blood libel or ritual murder in Gloucester in 1168. In 1181, the town of Bury St Edmunds, right? And in 1255, which is a century later, you have in Lincoln, right? Not Abraham Lincoln, just Lincoln. The case of Little St. Hugh, right? Isn't that so heart-tugging? You can understand, Rabbi Ephraim, how this type of imagery is working. Because just to come along, think about the dynamics of it. Just to come along and say, well, the Jews murder a Christian, that is very wicked and very dark, paints the Jews in a particular light fashion. But think of the resonance, think of the PR value of saying Little St. Hugh. The blood of which upstanding Christian would not boil to hear how they're slaughtering the kids, right? And notice the parallels today, Rabbi Ephraim. To come along and say, what is it that gives the Gaza cause, again, and it's again the Palestinian cause,
the suffering of the children,
pictures of the kids, right? We had a year or two ago the blood. Literally, do you remember that? The blood libel, another blood libel. The idea, the starving kids, right? The starving kids who were proven to be in Italy. They had bad illnesses, nothing to
allowed to go out by the Jews,
allowed to go out by the Israelis.
Right.
Again, the blood libel is always so much more effective when it's the kids, when it's the children, and that's a very important thing. Now, Rabbi Ephraim, I just want to test one particular thought on you, which is, what do you think? It's an interesting thing. we have the figure of this priest, Thomas of Monmouth, who comes up, writes this whole terrible blood libel, and he's the one who manufactures it against about St. William of Norwich. It was an interesting thing. He was the original. There's a parallel happening today, which is the ability to come along, like the YouTubers who will come into, I don't know, Lakewood or something today and say, the Jews, they're taking all the money and they're taking all our property and they're despoiling the Christians, etc. Think of it in those terms. Back then, the written words was very powerful in that way. And that's what Thomas of Monmouth does. He comes in and he investigates the case. He gets intrepid reporting. He's not going to be denied the truth. He's going to just ask questions, the questions that no one else dares to ask. And that is the same dynamic. Obviously not to paint not to create parallels where they don't exist. This is not poetic license. You see the dynamics again and again, that you could just, the power of the word, the power of just asking questions, and the power of just doing some reporting, especially when that reporting is skewed and false.
No, especially, I'm going back to the point that I said before, that you'll always be able to find like bits and bits of information that fit into the narrative of those accusing of the blood libel. I mean, you're always going to find people talking about Mashiach. You're always going to find people talking about the wish to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. And that, for the listeners, is enough of a proof, because that's part of your narrative, and you're proving those points. But the connecting dots, that is the ikar, and that you don't find proof for. That's where we have to attack them.
Correct. And I think it's interesting what you're saying. It's enough proof for the listeners. And that's because the people who fall for this want to hear this stuff. It falls on very fertile soil for them. They're already suspicious of Jews. And then somebody who's just asking questions, who's just doing the reporting that no one else will do, they hadn't been silenced by the corporate media or whatever it is, he's going to provide it. And then that's what they want to hear. And so it's always a question, I think, with the blood libels or these, what I call this blame the Jews. The blame the Jews dynamic is you got to look, it only works when the society is predisposed to it. A society that is fundamentally not, against that and is fundamentally tolerant. For hundreds of years in England, it would have been a laughable idea, this type of thing. Or across the West. And we have to ask ourselves, what has made the soil
so that's
more
the question
fertile?
I want to ask you, that we understand that in Nazi Germany, for instance, right? So we know that the economy was deep in trouble at that time. And when the economy is deep in trouble, that's fertile ground that you're looking for, right, Dalia?
Yeah.
But my question is, where's the soil in Europe in the medieval times that you were talking about? What is it built on? Is it built on economic stress? Did they have it at that time? I don't think that was I think it was more like a religious feeling of going to the Holy Land and all that. I think that was the trigger of this whole thing. Unless I'm mistaken. I don't know. I never heard that there was like economic stress at that time in England.
As ever, I think the answer is a combination. I think you're right to point out the fertile soil was overwhelmingly Christian, right? And it's not for nothing. So we're going to see that it's much, as perhaps you're going to mention soon, that the blood libel persists into the 19th, 20th century, Davka in Eastern Europe, right, where the church was unreformed, where the Russian Orthodox Church was immensely powerful, and it was underpinned the Tsarist regime and the whole system of government in a way that had not been the case in Western Europe for many hundreds of years.
So actually what you're saying is that there are two cases of blood libels. There's one case which is the religious blood libel that you're talking about now, that comes from Christian background, and then there's, let's say, Nazi Germany, which seemingly had nothing to do with that.
So you're correct in saying that they seem to be different things, and there's anti-Semitism has long been pointed out as a shapeshifter, and when a particular form of anti-Semitism is discredited, it will morph into something that's more polite, acceptable in polite society. Case in point is what's happening now. You can't talk about racial anti-Semitism like the Nazis. That's all discredited. You can't say, in other words, you can't say Jews have an inherent disposition to be, to suck the blood of others. You could say, though, that in polite society, you can say, well, we're not anti-Jewish, we're anti-Israel. It just happens to be that everything they've accused the Jews of always doing, right? What a mikra, what a happenstance they accuse the Israel of doing.
The problem with that is, and I asked someone this question, an academic asked this question, if that's the truth, then why every Jew in the United States is held accountable for the Zionist government in Israel? Even a leftist, that's what
because
I
obviously
I saw leftist, progressive Jews in the United States who suffered on the campuses, not because of their policy, not because of their
guilt and taint by association. Look, obviously, I think it goes without saying that anti-Semitism, they have their, in every bechol over there, they have their rational, intellectual explanation, but underlying it all is the sinner. So it's sinner, hatred doesn't discriminate. But I think it's important to understand the rich, fertile soil on which European anti-Semitism was built and the blood libel came to flourish was the atmosphere of anti-Semitism engendered by the church. The church had declared the Jews, they said, you killed our Lord. And that was all it took. And that's what they preached in their sermons every Sunday. But, and this is the important, the economic thing has always been a component. And it was present here as well from the very beginning. Because in each case, Jews are often associated for protective reasons. What
with
do
the
Jews,
nobility.
with the nobility, what do they do? They get close to the rulers.
The economic factor came into
Correct.
play.
And here in English, Norman England in the 12th century, you have usurpers, the outsiders. Remember, most people look at the French-speaking, most people speak English. And the Frenchies are the outsiders. And the Jews are associated with them. It happened in York, it happened in Norwich, it happened everywhere. Jews are associated with the power in the Khmelnytsky massacres as well. The Jews were associated by the Ukrainians with the nobility, and so they were slaughtered.
I want to bring up another aspect. Aside from the idea of being associated with power, the Gentile governments did not allow Jews, probably through the majority of the periods that Jews were in Europe, to engage in many trades.
So they were moneylenders.
Exactly. And moneylenders, that in itself is a factor for anti-Semitism and for libels.
Absolutely. So as soon as in York, it was a thing that as soon as they
aside
wanted
from the nobility part, it's the fact that you're having tons of goyim who owe money to Jews.
Mm-hmm. Very dangerous, precarious position to be in. I think, but Ephraim, there's a phrase here in the Israeli politics. They talk about the concentration, 3 words called hon, iton, shilton, right? Wealth, media, and government go together. I think just to backtrack a minute, just to understand what happens we've focused a lot over here on William of Norwich, because it's the genesis of it all. It's where it all incubates this entire ritual murder, blood libel charge. But what indeed happens afterwards, you just trace through the ages how it spreads through Europe and forces the Rishonim to intervene. Because what indeed happens afterwards, you have, as we said, Gloucester, Bury St Edmunds, Lincoln with its little St Hugh, but it quickly crosses over to continental Europe, right through the 12th and 13th century. And in England, there's a seminal date, there's a cutoff point for all of this. In 1290, the Jews are expelled. And so that's the end of the blood libel in England, because there are no more Jews left. And
until Menashe ben Yisrael convinced
Oliver Cromwell to let them in again.
Right.
And again, the Jews are expelled from France in 1306, Spain in 1492. But right through, and you can trace the blood libel through them, and we're going to, in a minute, talk about an important example of this among the Rishonim in France. But we find that as the Jews are expelled from Western Europe, where do they go? They go east. They go towards Poland, Lithuania, the Russian Empire, and there the libel persists, all up to the case of, and we'll return to this case in a minute after the Rishonim, discussing the Rishonim's response, the Beilis affair in Kiev in 1911.
Which is a very unique type of blood libel, because I think it was the first time there was an official court case with lawyers
litigating this
right,
libel.
Lawyers and journalists, and it was weird because it was so, excuse me for saying, it was so stupid and so not logical. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, it was all formal and judges and claims and accusations and lawyers and everything.
Which gives you an idea of how corrupt and how anti-Semitic and how baked in the blood libel was, how soaked into the fabric of the Russian Empire. And there's one more important date actually for mentioning, Ephraim, the Kishinev massacre, because the Kishinev massacre, which was it was around the end of the turn of the 20th century, I forget when it was exactly, the Kishinev massacre began with a blood libel again, and this was simply unbelievable that it persisted for so long, because it really went to the heart of Christianity, whereas Western Europe, Christianity was reformed, and it began to the church, the Catholic Church, progressively lost its power. Obviously, there was a part of that was there was an Inquisition, all that. It lost its sway. The Russian Orthodox Church had a chokehold on society in general. Rabbi Ephraim, I think maybe we can just turn to the response, what we know.
Yeah, we're talking about the blood libel, which is capsuled in a takana of Rabbeinu Tam as a fast day in Chof Sivan.
What happened then?
There's I don't know if it was a village or a city in France. You're going to have to help me how to pronounce it, but in the way the Rishonim talking about it, it's called Blois.
This is beautiful.
Blois.
It's nothing to do with the Riaka Bloy or the Bloy family. It has to do with, this is a classic case in which the Rishonim write, make up, we pronounce them in one way, whereas it goes like this. The way it's pronounced is Blois. Blois.
Okay.
Right? The OIS is wa, like that.
And the way the Rishonim write it, they write
Blois.
Beis, Lamed Vav, Yud Yun Shin.
Right, but Ephraim, look at this one. Everyone in yeshiva can tell you that we learn through a Tosfos and we learn about the Ri May or Lunch.
Right.
Now, if you get out your GPS and try and navigate your route, you will not find a place called Orlanche anywhere in France. Right? It is Orléans. Right, and it's because the NS, the Nun Shin, right?
So
it becomes.
It's like a little translation of the letters and not of the word.
Of not the sound. It's not phonetic.
The sound, right?
Correct. It's beautiful, and there's many.
So I'm not even going to try to repeat what you said.
Blois.
But in any case, it is a very weird blood libel over there, because usually a blood libel is based on a missing person.
Yep.
And in this case, there was no missing person.
What happened?
Someone, a Jew who used to deal with leather, I don't know if he was preparing shoes or preparing hide for cloth or something. That was his job. And he had extra scraps with him, in his suitcase, whatever it was. And he was drawing water from a river somewhere. Mm-hmm. And some of his extra scraps of white, shining leather fell into the stream where he was drawing water, and a slave of a Goyish landowner was there also drawing water, and he saw what he thought was a body of a child falling into the river, and no one reported a missing child, and that started a whole blood libel campaign, and at the end of the campaign there were 30 Jews murdered in that town. I think that was the entire populace of the Jewish populace of the town. I think 5 or a few kids were left, and they were baptized or something like that. I think that was the end of the Jewish population in that town. That's what I recall. And Rabbeinu Tam declared a fast day for it. And one of the Rishonim, Rabbi Ephraim Mibon, writes a sefer about all the tzaras that Klal Yisrael went through in the times of the Crusades, and he brings this under the title of Chof Sivan. And he records the events in his sefer, which is called Sefer HaZchira. And I think the one who put it out recently was, I think, a friend of yours. He's Moshe Hillel, the son of Yaakov Hillel.
Oh, I didn't know. Okay.
Yeah, he's the one who put out this.
I didn't know that. A beautiful thing.
It's called Sefer HaZchira of Rabbi Ephraim Mibon.
So you're saying that the unique factor it was like Sherlock Holmes, the mystery of the dog that didn't bark. In this case, it was the mystery of a child who didn't disappear, and yet they managed to convict the Jews. And I think the reason, the speculation, why is it that the Rabbeinu Tam created a tzom, a fast over here? And in fact, Rabbeinu Tam, quoting the Mordechai, says... Actually, there's a Mordechai at the end of Masechet Megillah, I think, in which he talks about the severity or lack of severity of Tanis Esther, in which, there's all sorts of Tanis Esther is one of the more lenient Tanisim, in which you don't actually need to fast because of any number of reasons. But he says on Chof Sivan, you need to.
Right.
Because more severe, says Rabbeinu Tam, than Tanis Esther, which is an unbelievable.
I think he said more than that. He said it's more severe than Tzom Gedalia.
Tzom Gedalia.
Which is a Chiddush already.
Okay.
Tzom Gedalia is not like Tanis Esther.
So the point being, that's the question, why would it have been treated in such a severe way? Some of the informed speculation has been that what happened in Chof Sivan was involved the connivance of the authorities. This is very important to understand. In 1144, William of Norwich, the authorities protected the Jews. Right?
This is the first time. This case is the first time.
1171,
the
which is later, right? A few years later, it was a local nobleman who wanted to settle scores with various, whatever the backstory was. He got involved. The authorities backed up it wasn't just coming from the rabble. It was the authorities were backing them up, which was a dreadful new precedent. I think it's always been said, to take it to today, you say you can have anti-Semitism on the street, but if the authorities support the Jewish community, then it could be seen as a different story. And Rabbi Elchonon indeed saw it as a different story, if that's the correct reading of what went on over there. But where else, Rabbi Ephraim, do we find reactions among the Rishonim to this whole episode of blood libels?
So we have from the early Achronim, really, right, from the Taz on Shulchan Aruch, and the Taz is talking about Leila Seder. The meaning of Leila Seder is to drink red wine, and the Taz says that there's for sure a preference for red wine. What's the reason? Why do we have a preference for red wine? So the Taz says, "The yesh od remez le adom zecher ladam shahoya paroi sheichet bnei Yisrael." Right, so there's a preference to use red wine for Leila Seder in order to remember the Gzeira of Paroi against the killing the Jewish kids.
So the red wine, as we all know, echoes
the blood of the Jewish kids in Mitzrayim. And then the Taz adds on a line, which is like an echo. You can hear the echo of what was going on in Europe for so many generations. V'ha'idna nimnu milikach yain odoim mipnei alilois shkorim ba'avisenu harabim. What is he talking about? That when you're using red wine, that allows for the anti-Semites to deliberately confuse that with blood, and that's how the blood libels spread. So the Taz is allowing us not to follow the minhag of using red wine on Leila Seder night.
Can I just add, just a thought this comes to me as you talk, Rabbi Ephraim, that that's a Taz, right? Hundreds of years ago. In the 19th century, late 19th century, the Mishpacha is written by Chavetz Chaim, where he quotes that Taz. Now, not every Taz of Mogen Avram or one of the Nois Kelim of Shulchan Aruch appears in the Mishpacha, which is, it's after all a Sefer of Pesach and of Halacha, and therefore, if it's there, it shows, I think, very clearly the continued relevance of this chashash.
That's a good point.
Which makes a lot of sense, because in the Russian Empire, which is where the Chavetz Chaim lived, yes, you had the Beilis trial, you had Kishinev, you had events that were, Alila Stam blood libels continue to be of halachic relevance and significance.
That's 100% true.
I think there's one more point on this, Rabbi Ephraim, this particular thing. I'm going to quote over here Rabbi Daniel Gladstein, who's a wonderful speaker and Talmud Chacham, I found something that he said. He quotes something from Heichal Idri Chazal Episkomeim by Rav Shimon Wertheimer. Perhaps you know this work. And who in turn quotes, this is already third hand, a medieval Haggadah variant that reads as follows: Shvoich ahavoscha el hagoyim. Instead of saying, pour out your anger, right, your wrath, rather, on the Goyim, it says, pour out your love upon the Goyim, upon the nations. And apparently, as we know, this was something, the most amazing thing. In a society where they'd accused Jews of drinking the blood of Christians against every tenet of halacha, in a society in which we had to change at the Seder red wine, which is halachically preferable, for white wine, can you understand what it is to, on that night, the night of a very sensitive time, it's almost like Pesach or Easter time was a very sensitive time, in the same way that today in Israel, Ramadan is an extremely sensitive time that the authorities do handle the case. The security services deal differently with the Palestinians, right? It's because of a very sensitive time. Easter, Pesach, was an extremely sensitive time because of the likelihood of blood libels. And for that reason, in that context, how explosive it would have been to have this written, Shvoich chamoscha el hagoyim shelo yiducha, to call for the wrath of God against the destruction of the Jews. So you have this incredible echo, this medieval Haggadah, Shvoich ahavoscha, but which couldn't be more of a rejection, or a total reversion, an inversion of what it really means. But they were forced to have this there.
Okay, so from here we're moving to the relatively modern blood libel, probably the last famous one, which is recorded in records of courts and protocols in the newspapers, Hebrew, Yiddish, whatever you want, Russian. And we're talking about the Mendel Bayless affair. It's interesting that if you go through the story itself, Rabbi Gedalia, and I read so much about it, it's actually very, very weird because the facts on the ground of that story were so clear to anyone who's objective that it's astonishing that so much time and so much energy was wasted on such a crazy idea. So let's give us the background of the story. Okay?
Yeah, what actually happened there?
Okay, we're talking about a lone Jew who had the right to live in an entirely Goyish surroundings. And this is Mendel Bayless, okay? Mm-hmm. At that time, you have to remember, Jews were not allowed to live in any place in Russia, right? There was a Pale of Settlement, right? There was certain, this is at the end of this kufa, but Jews were not living in that area where this took place. What was Mendel Bayless doing there? There was a brick factory, and he was the owner of the factory. Needed a smart Jew to take care of the office over there, and he found Mendel Bayless to take care of this factory. That's why he was allowed to live in this area. Now, the facts on the ground were very clear. This child that we're talking about, his body was found with many injuries, and his body was found bloodless, without blood in it, drained of blood, was involved in a local fight on that same day with a child from a different family who had connection to the underground in
the underworld, like a mafia type.
Right. And not only that, this child, because he was involved in the fight, he threatened the one who was fighting with him that he was going to snitch to the authorities that his mother was involved in tax evasion, all kinds of things like that. And there were accounts of people saying, what are we going to do with this kid? This kid is threatening us, okay? So you have all the facts on the ground.
It all leads to one conclusion, hold on. One guy killed another one, and the Jew was blamed. That's essentially the summary of what happened there.
Right. So what's interesting is that what are they accusing him? They're accusing him of ritual slaughter, right? Now, it seems that there was enough proof. People knew, the ones who were instigating this whole thing, there was enough proof that Jewish law in general prohibits eating blood.
That had been established time and again. It was
widely known. That was pashut. So they came up with another chiddush. Okay, this is very interesting over here. And you have to understand the situation is, people don't realize this. From the times of Vilna Gaon until the founding of Agudas Yisrael, with the Chofetz Chaim and all the other Rebbes, the Litvish and the Chassid were separate, meaning there was not...
The Chassidim and Misnagdim.
The Chassidim were not living together. They didn't know each other well, and each one was living in their own world. And there was an echo of this machlokes, going back from some times of the Vilna Gaon. And what happened over here is like this, the following. The Goyim said like this: we know that in Jewish law proper, there's an isser of eating blood.
Yeah.
Okay? But this Mendel Bayless is from a Hasidic family.
Right.
And Hasidus comes from Kabbalah. Okay?
Yeah.
And in Kabbalah, there you can find these concepts. Okay? They're trying to make a differentiation.
Wow. So you mean they had to come, they propagated this crazy idea that it was basically a Hasidic thing.
Exactly.
Well,
and here there was a big fear.
Shchita.
There was a big fear among the Hasidic Rebbes, especially I think the Sol Chotkova at that time, was that if they succeed in separating the Misnagdim from the Chassidim on this, it's going to be a terrible danger for Chassidim all over the world.
Correct. The Chassidim will have a target painted on their back.
Exactly. So it's very important that Misnagdim be involved in this effort, okay?
Fascinating.
And what's very interesting, people don't know this, but what's interesting is that the Chazon Ish at that time was a younger man, okay? And they found in his writings that this is way before the Chazon Ish became famous, okay? But they found in his writings that he prepared a whole like history of the world and history of halacha and all that, or to refute
Fascinating. Yeah, did you not know the Chazon Ish was
The
involved?
Chazon Ish, they found in his... At the end, they
What,
told him that they won't need it at the end. And
But who would
it
have
was-
asked him to? Who would have asked him
I don't know.
to do?
So what my
Was
feeling
that an effort on his own
that's
effort?
my feeling is, and I'm going to back up my feeling with an interesting, humorous story, that many Rabbanim at that time knew that things. It was a court case. You have to understand. It wasn't a regular blood libel. It was a court case.
It was
and Judaism was
international
on
sensation.
the bench, okay?
Right.
And there were claims going back and forth and citations from Chazal back and forth and from Halacha. And you had to make sure that things are presented properly.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that people from all over the world were sending in their suggestions how to, and I'll sort of bring an example for that. So they had to establish two things. They had to establish, number one, that Bayless itself was a chassid, okay? And there was a difference between chassidim and non-chassidim on this thing. Now, how did they establish that Bayless was a chassid? Because they found that he had a friend in that area who he ate breakfast with him, I think, that morning. His name was Schneerson.
Schabatska.
Oh, so you think Chabatska, right? So the anti-Semites knew this, okay? They knew the name Schneerson was the Rebbe of Chabad. So they even called him that he ate breakfast with the Tzaddik Schneerson, okay? In order to give it the feeling that he was a chassid, right?
And associating with the top.
Right.
It was
Now, the
reached
facts
all the way to
were
the top.
that Ledavonenu, Bayless was not a Shomer Shabbos. Okay? He was running a factory.
Right.
And his employers forced him to work on Shabbos.
It wasn't that frum.
He wasn't that frum. And here comes the big surprise. They're forcing Schneerson. Okay, so Bayless is eating breakfast with the Tzaddik Schneerson, right? So he must be a chassid, right? Now, Bayless is not frum, okay? So one of the ploys was, okay, we're going to bring Schneerson, the Tzaddik Schneerson, to testify in court that he was connected to him. So they describe that all of a sudden the Tzaddik Schneerson walks in and he's a clean-shaven, bareheaded, modern Russian
Nishkan
Jew.
Tzaddik. As Israeli say, Lo Tzaddik v'lo nalayim.
Right, exactly. And they're asking him, do you know that there's a tzaddik in Judaism called Schneerson? No, I'm not aware that there's a Rebbe like that and all that. Do you have
the expert witness, their star witness just turns out to be a total dud.
Exactly. And it describes, the court case describes people like looking at the Tzaddik Schneerson walking into the courtroom. And
Great.
This is the Tzaddik Schneerson.
Great. So the thing blew up?
So it didn't blow up. So they had the expert witness who was unbelievable. Like the expert witness for Judaism at that time was Rabbi Yaakov Mazeh, who was the Rav of Russia at that time, from Moscow, I think, at the time. And he was a very learned and articulate Jew. And it was the end of the sessions in the court case. And he got up to speak, okay? And he spoke for hours and hours. And people thought that people were going to run out because they were bored. But he
was riveting.
He was riveting, and it's all written down. You can find all the words.
I mean, it was just 115 years ago.
Yeah, and he goes through halacha, goes through Kabbalah, goes through Chassidus, and they say that he really changed the tide. He was so impressive that he really changed the tide. At the end, by the way, he was not guilty.
Found not guilty. Although it has to be said, they got away with it. The jury, if I'm not mistaken, said that he was not guilty, and yet he said that the death had the hallmarks of a ritual murder.
You have to understand that the jury at that time, I don't know about the judges, the jury were like these poyers, like the Pasha Goyish peasants.
And they couldn't let the charge go totally declared.
I just want to allow me to end off with one historical thing that I found. And this is when I was growing up, and probably you heard it as well, there's a famous story about Rav Meir Shapiro Lublin, who told Rabbi Yaakov Mazeh to answer one of the questions in the court. As I said, they're always quoting from Chazal and all that. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Atem kruyim Adam, ve'en akum kruyim Adam.
Which is a Gemara in Yevamos.
Right. So the question is, how can you say about that? We're not
Jews are people,
and you're not human. We're not human.
That is one of the. I mean, it's just ready. It's red meat for accusations of.
So Rav Meir Shapiro told Rav Mazeh to tell the court that the question of the Gemara was, that why are Jews called Adam and Goyim are called Anoshim. Anoshim in the plural. Like by Jews it's in the singular, Adam, and by Goyim it's Anoshim. And the reason is because a Jew feels the source of the Jews, and therefore it's like one body, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why Jews are called Adam.
Because of the unity. The Jews operate as one.
That is the story that I grew up with, okay? When I was preparing this for an article, the fear for an article, so I went through Rabbi Yaakov Maz's protocols that he wrote by himself
Must be fascinating
for publication in Hatzfira, and surprise, they never asked him that question,
right?
And never came up. So I was thinking to myself,
a legend.
So where did this come from? So I'm getting back to the Chazon Ish again. My feeling is that the Rabbanim at that time, they were thinking to themselves, what questions can they ask Rabbi Yaakov Mazza on the bench? Right? And how can we supply answers to that? So the Chazon Ish is preparing something. And
Rameir Shapiro also came up, and it's been accepted as part of the record.
From what I saw, did not appear in the records of the...
Fascinating. I think that ties in very neatly to one final thought, which is that there's an absolutely fascinating and famous perspective, a chilling perspective from Rav Elchonon Wasserman, related to this idea of the state of the Jewish people and the fact that blood libels have something to do with the inner state of Am Yisrael. Rav Elchonon Wasserman, Kovetz Mamorim, famously asked the following thing. He says, we know there's a rule, and he asks us about the blood libel. We know that there is a rule, the Chazal tell us, that sheker in lo raglaim, something, a 100% lie cannot stand. Something that has no grain of truth simply won't last. It has no permanence and no substance. Every sheker has to contain a kernel of emes. That's what Chazal tell us. And Rav Elchonon asks in Kovetz Mamorim, he says, what about the blood libel? The blood libel is 100% false. There cannot be lo soichlos adam. It's an issa to eat blood, right? It's such a barefaced lie. It has no substance to it. And he says, how can it be, therefore, that for 1,000 years it's been the most deadly scourge on the Jewish people? How can it be? It's a great question. And he says the following things. He says the following words. He says, it's clear, this punishment, it must be something, a punishment, midah keneged midah, right? In paying in kind for eza oven shnifrom avurei kol hadoros. From the fact that it's so persistent, it's lasted 1,000 years, it is so deadly, and it's such a lie. It must be a heavenly form of punishment for an ancient and persistent avera that Hashem claims retribution from every so often. Now we know that, Rabbi Ephraim, we know that type of language from it says, Hashem will, when you're being punished, you'll be punished for this as well. And he says the following thing, and he suggests, and were it not for the fact that I'm not of sufficient stature to say what I'm about to say, it's because the Jew in Mechiras Yosef, when the brothers sold Yosef, they dipped his cloak, his garment, into blood, and they pretended to Yaakov that he was, and he says, that was such an earth-shattering, cosmic chait and sin that has persisted throughout the generations. V'im shogisi, he says, if I've made a mistake, Hashem hatov yechaper ba'adi. The good God, Hashem, should atone for me. But he's saying this is what he thinks is the blood libel. Now there's a twist here, because and this is also well known, those who have seen the writings and heard the Haggadah of Ramatisiyahu Salomon. Ramatisiyahu Salomon asks, based on the words of Rav Elchonon Wasserman, the frightening and words of Rav Elchonon Wasserman, what is it, he says, there's one final question. Why is it that always at Pesach, it was the blood libel came to be associated with Pesach? Obviously, we understand that the mechanics, the Jews need the blood for this, we understand. But in terms of the Hashgacha Elyona, the divine process by which Hashem is arranging for these metaphysical things to happen, why is it? And so he says that it's linked. He says that there is we dip the karpas, and the karpas is there to recall that one of the things that's not said in the Haggadah. In the Haggadah, we talk about what happened when we got to Egypt. But why do we get into Egypt? Why do we go to Mitzrayim? Well, we know why we got to Mitzrayim. It was a process by which they were sold because the brothers sold Yosef, and that led us. And yet that's not mentioned in the Haggadah, Matisyahu says. Strange thing, right? How we talk about what happened in Mitzrayim. The Haggadah Shel Pesach is an origin story, and yet it doesn't describe the origin of how we got there. And that is, it's the Ben Ish Chai, it's there in the words Karpas, the kar is part of mochar, is the pas is ksoines pasim, and the Ben Ish Chai says that it's got to do the karpas remembers the chet of the Mechiras Yosef, the selling of Yosef, which was the trigger for the Now, what was Mechiras Yosef responsible? What was that? It was an act, as we know, of sinas chinam. And so Matisyahu was saying that Pesach is a time when we've got to repair the act of sinas chinam that brought us to Mitzrayim again, right? And to bring us all together. Pesach is a time for Mishpacha, you gather together. And he says, no coincidence then that blood libels surfaced around Pesach, because the time when Am Yisrael are meant to be to a tikkun and fix, as it were, the sinas chinam, which is the underlying trigger for the Mitzrayim, the Golus Mitzrayim, if they don't do such a thing, then Pesach we get the reminder of such a thing, which is an earth-shattering understanding of the process of this thing. And so, Rebbe Ephraim, to me, this begs the question. Here we're going through, whether it's technically a blood libel or it's the category, whether it's technically ritual murder, as this imagery which is returned in Gaza and in the artist, as we began, who's now publishing in England, his works are on display using the medieval imagery of Jews, absorbing and drinking that blood. Whether it's technically a blood libel or just simply blame the Jews, the dynamic is the same. And Rav Elchonon Wasserman was saying we have to look deeper. There's a midah keneged midah. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the midah keneged midah of the return of the blood libel? Well, Matisyahu, Rav Elchonon Wasserman was already saying there's a sinas chinam. No better than that, but it's at least something startling to look at this process. For 1,000 years, the blood libel, here we are once again.
Thank you, Rabbi Gedalia.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.